Hey everyone, welcome back to MCG. I hope you all had a great weekend and a great Halloween. I'm really excited today because we are going to be starting our first installment of our consulting technical series, which today we'll be covering casing. So I kind of want to give you guys just a quick overview about the series. So essentially the goal of the series is to give you guys the foundational knowledge or the ability to answer pretty much every technical question that you might come across in a consulting interview, whether that be casing, market sizing, and brain teasers. And then we'll be reinforcing this throughout the series through in-group practices, as well as like breakout room practices. So cool. So really what I think my goal of this series is, and we did this last semester, and now that we've trialed run it a bit and we've made some improvements, really what I want you guys to get out of this is to go from a place where you don't really have any experience in casing or in market sizing, or maybe even in like doing interviews in general. But by the end of the series, by coming to all three of these meetings, you leave with the foundational knowledge to pretty much answer any of these questions, and then to build upon it with practice through mock interviews with like your friends or upperclassmen. So today what we'll be covering is casing. And so how we'll be covering it is, first, I'll give you guys kind of a high level overview about what makes up a case. And then we'll go into a live case demo with one of our co-directors of CCC, James, just to give you guys a feel about what the case looks like and what are the best practices when you are the interviewee. And then lastly, we'll be going really in depth into kind of the theory behind casing. What are the different parts to casing? What do you have to do in each of these parts? And then also along with some breakout room practices to really reinforce these ideas. So without further ado, can anyone tell me what a case interview is? Or does anyone know what a case interview is? Feel free to just come off mute and then just say.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
So okay, thank you. Case interview is you are given a problem and then you need to frame a structure and then identify what is the root cause for the problem and then solve the problem with the interviewer within the time frame. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, perfect. So that's actually a really great overview about what a case interview is. So just to give you guys kind of a breakdown, what a case interview is basically, like she said, they're giving you a prompt or a business problem, and you're role playing as the consultant who's on this engagement, right? And so your end goal, right, is to end up solving the problem, providing a recommendation to your client. So how a case interview is broken down is into 4 steps. First is the prompt. So the interviewer will give you the prompt. So this is the background about the case, and also what the problem specifically the company is facing. You'll essentially write down the prompt, summarize it back to them, all the important information, and then you'll start the next step, which is frameworking the problem. So the purpose of frameworking the problem is not to come up with a laundry list of solutions, but more of to create a methodology in which you can evaluate the problem. So what I mean by that is you're essentially trying to figure out what are the most important areas of the problem that you can look into. And so when you framework the problem, you'll take like a minute, write down your thoughts about the problem, and then you'll present it back to the interviewer. And then after you do that, you'll pick a specific bucket or a specific category that you want to explore and want data on. So for example, if I want, say data about like sales of the company, right? I'll say, oh, do you have any data relating to the sales of the company or like the future like revenue of the company? And then this will get into our next step, which is analyzing the exhibits, where you'll be given kind of like a graph or a table, and you'll be asked to do some sort of calculations on it, as well as kind of analyze the graph to your interviewer. And then after a few of these exhibits, we lastly get into the recommendation portion of the interview, which can be broken down into 3 different ways. So this is, the solution, risks, and then the next steps. And then you'll present these 3 categories to your interviewer. So this is a very high level breakdown, and don't worry if I kind of went too fast or if you missed anything, because we will reinforce these ideas when we start the live case demo, as well as when we go into kind of the theory portion, and we'll speak more specifically about each of these steps. So now I want to get into the case demo with our co-CCC director, James. So James is going to be acting as the interviewee, and then I'll be acting as the interviewer. And I'll pause for questions, as well as kind of explain why James is doing the things that he is as we go through it. So perfect. So we're going to start the prompt stage of the case. So I'm going to read aloud the prompt. So James, are you ready? Okay, cool. So our client, Dark Sky, is a small manufacturer of an unmanned data collection aircraft. Dark Sky produces the Assessor, an aircraft originally designed for unmanned weather exploration. In 2003, the United States military began purchasing assessors for use in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. These are called ISR missions. The Assessor is profitable, but sales have stagnated and the client wishes to grow. What are some steps Dark Sky could take to achieve growth?
Great, thank you so much. And I'm really excited to work on this problem with you today. If I could quickly just repeat back some of the information you covered. Our client in this case is Dark Sky, and they're really a manufacturer of some data collection aircraft. Specifically, they've produced the Assessor in years past, which has focused largely on unmanned weather exploration. Back in 2003, Dark Sky began a contract with the United States military, where these assessors were purchased for ISR missions. And even though the Assessor continues to be profitable, sales seem to have stagnated. So we're looking for some solutions to maybe increase either on the price or the quantity side.
Perfect. I think you have all the information.
Great. So then could I take a couple seconds just to quickly think through my approach to this problem?
Yep. Okay. So I just want to pause really quickly. So what did James do? So first I read the prompt to him, and then immediately, or so during when I was reading the prompt, James was taking notes on what is the most important information in the prompt, right? So he said kind of what the company is, some background information, right? Like they're a manufacturer of unmanned data collection aircrafts. They're located in the United States. And then also, most importantly, he said what the ask of the company was, which is what are some steps Dark Sky could take to achieve growth. And then after he took notes on this, he summarized back the important information to me to make sure that he had all the background correct. If you don't have some of the background correct, or if you misheard something, the interviewer will correct you and provide you with that information. And then lastly, what he did was he asked for a minute to framework out his thoughts. So during this portion, you would get like a minute to like a minute 10. Don't worry about getting into this time frame for your like first case interview, because just getting frameworks down that quickly takes a lot of practice. And then after he would have written down his framework, he would present it to me. And so this is what he would have written down.
Great. So I want to walk through my approach and how I'm thinking through this problem. So in considering this, I'm really looking at 4 main categories. Dark Sky, our client itself, some of the customers that we've had historically, competitors in the UAV space, as well as the general profitability of the company, as well as the Assessor. Speaking about Dark Sky specifically, I want to know about the general financial situation, whether we're well capitalized and whether or not we're in a position to either launch new products or pivot the current Assessor product. Again, related to that, I want to know about our current product mix. I know that we're focused on the Assessor, but are there any products we've produced historically? Are there any products in the R&D pipeline? Is there anything else we can leverage to create a bigger product portfolio? I also want to know about our brand perception, whether the US military historically has been happy with the Assessor, whether there have been any other customers that we have a relationship with, and anything there we can tap into. On the customer side, obviously with a contract with the US military, we care a lot about the government regulations here and knowing whether or not there's actually room for us to grow in terms of acquiring new customers. We also want to know whether the US military has any changing preferences over recent years to better tailor our products. And thus, both of those will lead us to consider whether there's any real expansion opportunities, at least on the customer side. We also want to know whether our competitors in the UAV space have been doing anything that we haven't been following in recent years, whether it be best practices that we can learn from, or discovering new product niches that we can expand into. Additionally, we want to know how we really stack up in terms of market share against our competitors and whether the market is generally very fragmented. And ultimately, we will also want to see if there's any opportunities for M&A to grow, hopefully our sales, but also our product portfolio. And then in terms of profitability, which seems to be key here, we want to know whether revenue breaks down well in terms of price and quantity, whether we've seen any changes in recent years, either in terms of price or in terms of quantity. And in terms of the cost side, which might be a little less important here, we should consider the fixed costs and variable costs of Dark Sky and the assessor itself. But ultimately, I do think, based on the sales stagnation that our client Dark Sky mentioned, that the revenues side would likely be the most important. So do we have any data either on revenue over the past couple of years in general, or specifically on price or quantity?
Perfect. So we do have data on that. Before we get to that, I quickly want to pause and kind of explain what James did there. So essentially, right, what he did was he frameworked the problem, meaning that he divided up the areas or buckets of the problem that he thinks are important to cover, or he thinks that there might be like potential data on. And so what James first started out with doing was reiterating what the prompt was. So like, right, what are some steps Dark Sky could take to achieve growth? And in order to do this, we'll look at 4 main categories. Notice also how he's not giving solutions to the question. He's more of trying to explore the problem and where the solution might lie, rather than just straight out giving a recommendation. Does anyone have any particular questions on what we just covered before we move on? Feel free to just unmute yourself and then say it.
Hi. Yeah. So you mentioned that, like, or James mentioned, I think this category would be the most important to address. I'm going to ask for data on this. Does that mean that when we set a framework, it's not necessarily that we want to analyze every part of it?
Yeah. So what James did at the end there is called pushing the case forward. So basically, after you present your framework, you want to start with the category or the bucket that you believe will most likely lead to an exhibit, or will most likely help you to solve the problem if there is data on it. What's really good about the other buckets of the framework that you don't start with is that, say, for example, there is no data on that. Or for example, there is data on that, but now you've analyzed that exhibit, done the math on it, and now you have to push the case forward again. You can refer back to your framework and pick another bucket where you think has a high likelihood of helping you solve the problem, or a high likelihood of having data. And that's the purpose of like the other 3 buckets that you don't choose. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Okay, perfect. Anyone else?
Hi, yeah, I have a question on the like driven of the problem. So like James just now says like revenue is the main problem here. So like how did he figure out like this is the main problem, or it's just from experience?
Yeah, so James isn't saying that the main problem is profitability. What James is saying is that he thinks kind of like most likely that the data, like financial data, would be helpful in solving the problem, right? Because the problem is, right, how can Dark Sky achieve growth, right? And usually in cases, there's information on financials, like there's information on either revenue or there's information on costs. Especially when we're trying to figure out how a company can grow, revenue and cost or profitability is extremely important. And so that's probably like the most likely place to start. Does that answer your question?
Yes, but like when we ask for financial information, usually we need to ask specific information, like if it's revenue or cost. So how do you determine like which part to start first?
So I think that's really based off of kind of like what the ask is, right? So like the ask in here is like, how could dark sky take to achieve growth, right? And so say, for example, you think the answer lies within profitability. You could either say like, oh, like we want specific data on revenue. You could say, do you have any data on like revenue and costs of like their current product line? Things like that, right? And for say, for example, you don't like, say, for example, you only say revenue, right? The interviewer will then say like, oh, but like, what other things are important to profitability? Or they'll say like, oh, we don't have data on that, but we have other data on financials. And then maybe then you bring up like costs, right? If you don't bring them up at first. But okay, so moving along in the case, James, can you just repeat how you push the case forward?
Sure, but we have some questions in the chat.
Oh, we
are
do?
Vanessa and Eric getting to those?
Yep.
I think there was one question Trisha asked that I think is pretty good. Are we assuming that James has already asked clarifying questions to narrow his discussion down? Yeah, so I think clarifying questions, it's kind of a hard topic to cover because it's hard to know when clarifying questions are necessary. Clarifying questions are questions that you can ask immediately after the prompt is given if you don't really understand the scope of the case. In this case, I kind of knew that the main objective was that sales were stagnating. And I also had some grasp of the business model, so I didn't ask any clarifying questions myself. But if you weren't sure how, a contractor, a military defense contractor, or like a UAV company or anything like that really produces their products or sells their products or anything like that, those are good questions you can ask during the clarifying question section.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so again, given the sales that have stagnated over the past couple of years, I think it's pretty important for us to take a look at any data we have on revenue, whether it be on the price or the quantity side.
Perfect. So we actually do have data on that. So can you first kind of analyze this exhibit for me or tell me what it's talking about?
Sure. So it looks like this is, a chart that shows revenue for, is this for Dark Sky as a firm or is this for only the assessor?
So this is only for the assessor.
Okay, perfect. So it looks like this is a revenue exhibit for the assessor between the years 2000 and 2010, showing total revenue on the y-axis. It looks like some key points is that there's relatively little growth between 2002 and 2000, or sorry, between 2000 and 2002. We know that Dark Sky signed a contract with the US government in 2003, which largely explains for the huge growth in sales between 2003 and 2006, growing from looks like around one-ish million to 5 million in total revenue. And then since 2006 onwards, for the past 4 years, it looks like revenue has been pretty stagnant, though we're not really sure from the price or quantity side.
Exactly. So just to take a quick pause for a moment, notice what James did there, right? So he was given an exhibit that he didn't see before and has no idea what it's talking about. And instead of asking for like, say like a minute to like analyze it, what he did was as he basically walked through his thought process of analyzing the graph to the interviewer, which is something that's really important and something that you really wanted to do. And so what he did, right, is he said like, oh, what's on the y-axis? Oh, so we have revenue on the y-axis. And then on the x-axis, we have years. So this is showing us revenue over time. There's no title to the graph, so we clarified what revenue was exactly pertaining to, whether that to be to the actual company or to the main aircraft that they were selling, which is the assessor. Okay, cool. So we have some questions for you about this graph. So the first question is, how many units were sold in 2010? And then secondly, what was the growth rate from 2002 to 2006?
Yeah, great. So do we have a price figure for what we were charging for each unit of the assessor in 2010?
Yeah, so we can assume that it was 5 million.
Okay, so with 5 million in total sales in 2010, and knowing that the price of each unit is 100,000, we can quickly calculate that we sold 50 units in 2010 and likely approximately the same from 2006 onwards. In terms of the growth rate from 2002, I know that to calculate growth rate, you take the new value minus the old value over the old value. In 2006, we had 5 million in revenue. In 2002, we had 0.5 million in revenue, which means we're taking a division of 4.5 million over 0.5 million, giving us a 900% growth rate.
Okay, perfect. So, right, what James did there was usually, right, you would be like writing down the math and explaining it as you do it. Well, what you do is, right, you start with like the formula. So for the first question, right, how many units were sold in 2010? What James did is he knows how much revenue we got in 2010, and then he knows like what the unit cost of like one assessor is, right? So he knows that this revenue is purely made up of revenue from assessors. So he did the 2010 revenue divided by the unit cost, which gets him, right, like the number of units. Secondly, for the growth rate, he walked us through what the growth rate formula is first, which is the change in revenue divided by the base year's revenue. So it'd be like 2006 minus 2002 divided by the 2002 revenue. And that yields us, right, 900%. Cool. And then James, what's the next step you would take after solving the exhibit questions?
Yeah, great. So based on the data given, it seems like the sales potential for the assessor has somewhat stagnated. So I'm interested to see whether there's any opportunities in terms of a product portfolio standpoint where we could launch new products, or if there's any data on things currently in the R&D pipeline.
Great. So we actually do have data on that. Before we get to that, again, what James is doing there is he's pushing the case forward. So after he answered the questions that are pertaining to the exhibit and did all the calculations, he's now trying to figure out how to get to the next exhibit. And how you do that is basically based on what you currently solved, you have an idea of where the case is going, and then you ask the interviewer for new information, right, pertaining to that. Does anyone have any questions on this first exhibit before we go to the next one?
Yeah, sorry. Could you repeat how he pushed the case forward this time? Like he noticed that sales were stagnant, and then what did he ask? Sorry.
James, do you want to repeat that?
Sure. So, based on the data given, it seems like sales specifically for the assessor have stagnated. So in my opinion, it seems like there's not a lot of potential for growth for the assessor, as it's unlikely that our client did absolutely nothing to try to increase sales for those 4 years. Based on that, I'm interested to see if there's any other products that we could launch so that we could avoid having to see continued stagnation.
Right, because like a potential solution could be producing like different products, right, to drive revenue, since like the assessor's revenue has been stagnant over time. Does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, how did you get the unit cost?
Yeah, so the unit costs were given in this case. We know that the unit cost was 100,000. That was given to you as part of the prompt. And so given that you can kind of eyeball the 5 million, you know that the total sales was 50.
Yeah, apologies. I think James asked a clarifying question about that, and I misheard him and I gave him the wrong answer. So he would have clarified, right, like what is the unit cost? And then I would have said, oh, right, like it's what, 0.1 million. So sorry, that was just on me. Cool. So moving on, so we do have data on potential products that we might sell in future years. So can you just start off by analyzing these exhibit for me?
Sure. So it looks like this is a new product sales forecast for the year 2011, next year presumably. It looks like there's 3 products currently in the R&D pipeline between the Seabird, Sandbird, and Jointbird, with differing demand between the Navy and Army. It looks like we also have price figures, not only for what the assessor would be charged at in 2011, as well as what we would be charging for the Seabird, Sandbird, and Jointbird. And then it also looks like we have data on how many assessor units are lost to cannibalization. Nick, could I clarify what cannibalization means?
Perfect. Yeah. So what cannibalization means is when a company starts selling similar products, how much does that impede on the sales of like the current products or the past products that they were selling? So just for your guys' understanding, think of this like the new iPhone coming out, right? Which is like, so like, think about like, oh, the iPhone 10 came out, right? And then that cannibalizes sales from like the iPhone 9, for example. You can think about it that way. That's a really easy way to think about it. But also, look what James did there, right? He didn't know what a particular word meant in the case, and then he asked for clarification on that. You can do that in an interview, and I highly suggest you do that rather than kind of like loosely pretending that you know what like cannibalization means and then screwing up the calculations later on in the interview. But perfect. So could you tell me, based on this exhibit, how to maximize short-term growth, which aircraft should Dark Sky additionally produce?
Sure. So my approach to figuring out what aircraft Dark Sky should approach based on having a projected number of units that could be sold, as well as having a projected price figure, would be to calculate the total revenue potential for each of the launches. So for example, we know that if we had stuck with the Assessor, given that we're likely still going to sell 50 units, and given that we're still charging, or that we're charging now a price of 110,000, that pursuing this venture would have a potential revenue of 5.5 million. Pursuing the Seabird, we know that the Seabird will be priced at 220,000 per aircraft, and we're projecting 50 sales to the Navy exclusively, giving us a total revenue on that side of 11 million. However, we know that because of the cannibalization figure, we have to discount some potential sales from the Assessor instead of just adding 5.5 million to that figure, because we're assuming that we're only losing some portion of the Assessor sales. Given that there's 40% cannibalization, we're really looking at a 14.3 million total potential revenue from the Seabird. I'm going to run similar calculations with the Sandbird and Jointbird, given their differing price as well as projected number of units sold figures. And through doing that, I know that the Sandbird likely has a projected revenue of 14.25 million, and the Jointbird has a projected revenue of 16.75 million.
Perfect. So again, right, what James did there was given the question, he figured out what calculation he could potentially do given the data. And then he walked me through first what the formula he was going to be using for. And then in like a real case, right, you would be like writing out the math on a piece of paper. And as you're writing out the math, you would be explaining to the interviewer what numbers you're multiplying, what numbers you're adding, what exactly are you doing, just so that the interviewer can follow along and there's not this like long pause of silence where they have like no idea what you're doing. But perfect. Does anyone have any questions about how James went about doing this exhibit?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question in the chat, Henry. Could we go to the last slide real quick, Nick?
Okay, yeah, hold on.
Yeah, so since we know that it's a new product sales forecast, this is data that the client or the R&D department maybe from the client is giving us in helping management, or in this case, the consultant, help decide on what venture should be pursued. So that because we know that it's a forecast for 2011, and because we know that last year was 2010, we know that this is projected sales going forward, not actual sales figures.
Are there any other questions in the chat? Oh, yeah, sorry. Go for it.
Yeah, no, I guess my question was just like, because when I first saw this, I thought that they were actually going to produce like Seabird, Sandbird, and Jointbird, and they were saying like if we sell all of these, this is like, I guess how much we would sell. But like, so I got confused after like in the next slide, because I was like, oh, I thought we were gonna go ahead with all these, with all these aircrafts.
Yeah, so from an R&D perspective, it's generally really difficult to launch like 3 new holistic products at the same time. You know, whether or not you want to launch multiple of them can be a consideration as well. But likely in the immediate short term, you're probably really picking the one that has the most profit potential.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Also, just if you have any kind of misunderstanding of what the question was, right? You can look back to like what the exhibit question was saying, right? to maximize short-term growth, which aircraft should dark sky additionally produce? So like that wording kind of implies that they're only going to produce like one other aircraft in combination with the assessor. Cool. So perfect. So moving on to the last part of the case. So the CEO walks into the room and wants a solution to dark skies problem. What do you tell them?
Yeah, great. So based on our discussion and some of our analysis thus far, we know that the assessor is the primary cause of why sales have stagnated recently, and we recommend that Dark Sky launch the Joint Bird and primarily sell to the US military in order to boost sales growth. The primary reason we arrived on the Joint Bird was due to the higher projected revenue that we saw from sales forecast figures, over 2 million more than the Seabird and the Sandbird. Despite that, we do recognize that the Joint Bird has the highest potential cannibalization of the assessor. And so if there's any potential reason that we need to continue producing the assessor and reaching high levels of sales on that, maybe the Joint Bird isn't the best choice. However, based on sales figures alone, we believe that the Joint Bird is definitely the best choice to pursue. That being said, we based our recommendation largely on the sales forecast as well as revenue projections, but we don't necessarily know how this translates into profits, and we don't have a good grasp on the R&D costs of the Seabird, Sandbird, and Joint Bird. That's why we need to collect more data going forward on the potential margins of each of the product lines and see whether the Joint Bird having the highest projected revenue actually ends up translating into the highest potential profit. We need to get more data on the general margins, as well as if we have any data and information on projected R&D costs and other fixed costs.
Okay, perfect. So this is when the case interview would basically end, when James gives his recommendation to the interviewer. So usually how you know that we're transitioning to the recommendation stage is after the last exhibit, the interviewer will say something to the effect of you meet like the CEO in like some random room in the company, like there's all different variations. And so they'll be like, oh, the CEO walks into the room and wants an answer to the problem, right? Or wants you to tell him an answer to, like, right, in this case, like dark skies growth problem. And so what James did, right, is he broke up the recommendation into 3 separate parts. The first was his solution, where he said first, right out of the gate, what the solution was to the case, and then gave what his supporting evidence of that solution was based on the exhibits that he analyzed. Then secondly, what he did was he prefaced it with risks, right? So based on maybe lack of data in the case, or based on like some problems that he saw in the data, what are the risks that his solution presents? And then lastly, he used next steps as a way of mitigating the risks that he previously talked about, right? So he said like one of his risks was, right, we don't have like enough data to really figure out if pursuing Joint Bird is a good venture. And so what he said in his next steps was, we can mitigate this by gathering like X specific data that would help us get a finer calculation or a better idea if this project will be successful. And that's how the case will end. So this really concludes the live casing portion of this presentation. So does anyone have any questions regarding what we did in this portion? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so when you're like doing an actual interview, what exactly is distinguishing you from like other applicants? Like what exactly are you looking for? So would this be like some ideal recommendation, like would this be an ideal walkthrough, or could someone else do something better somehow? So how would someone pick between you and what someone else presents?
Perfect. So I can give an answer to this, and James, maybe you want to like bolster it after. But generally, okay, in terms of solution, right? The company or the case usually has like a specific solution that they want you to reach. And then in terms of the risks and next steps, that's where you can like really differentiate yourself by like saying like, oh, saying that there's like, you can get creative with like what the risks are, and then also like how you could potentially mitigate those risks. Another way of differentiating yourself is in the frameworking part, right? Because this is also where you can get really creative, where you can essentially show them what your thought process is of analyzing the prompt, and maybe you come up with like a bucket or like a specific subtopic that no interviewer has come up with. And then I think the last way to differentiate yourself in this interview is being very structured in your approaches, right? So you really want to make sure that you're always walking your interviewer through what you're doing, what you're thinking at the time, but also having like a structure to it, right? Where you're just not like randomly giving a laundry list of potential solutions, or like you're not just like going silent during the math portion of the exhibit, or you're not going silent when you're like analyzing the exhibit. You're really showing them that you can analyze things in a very structured manner to lead to this comprehensive recommendation that we have at the end. James, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think the 3 points Nick covered are all really important. I think aside from that, understand that consulting is a client services first industry, and understand that the case interview is a very personal, interactive interview. And so from that perspective, how you communicate information, how you're going about, confirming things that you're sure about, confirming on things that you're not sure about, and how you go about interacting with your interviewer in a very soft skills driven sense is going to be extremely important, because regardless of whether you arrive at the end recommendation, what your interviewer is going to remember is the impression that you left on them. And so how you communicate with them, how you work with them throughout the problem, and how you work with them to the solution is going to be really important. And that's always important to keep in mind, especially for anything consulting related.
Cool. So in the interest of time, we're going to move on. However, I definitely think that if you guys have any questions about the case, definitely type it in the chat, but I'll probably cover it within our next section. Where we're going to go specifically into each of the 4 steps, and specifically what you need to say and what you need to do in order to have a really good interview. So again, the four steps, right, in a case interview go as follows, right? It's the prompt, where you're given the background information about the case. It's the frameworking the problem, where you're writing down kind of your methodology or your buckets to analyze the problem, and then presenting that to the interviewer. Then you're analyzing the exhibits. So as you saw in the case demo, we get kind of graphs and tables where you'll need to do some sort of calculations to really drive the case forward and get enough data to end up on that end recommendation. And then that brings me right to the presenting the recommendation part, which again, we did in 3 different steps. So let's start off by diving into what we have to do in the prompt, right? So the main takeaway from the prompt is what you want to do is understand what the client's business is, specifically their problem, and then what they are asking of you, the consultant. So as we saw in the case demo, there's kind of like we can break this up into really 3 categories. So the first is taking notes on the prompt. So you want to write down the most important parts of the prompt, whether this be the company's details, like where the company is located, what they do, the problem. So what problem are they currently experiencing? And then what I call the ask, right? So what exactly do they want from you, the consultant, to solve, or what recommendation are they trying to end up at? And then next we have summarizing the prompt. So right, as James did, once he received what the background information was, he summarized not the entire prompt, right? But he summarized the important points of the prompt back to the interviewer to make sure that he has all the information. Because if you have something wrong, like if you wrote down something wrong or missed like a revenue figure, that could really impact the rest of your case. So you really want to make sure at the front that you have all the information necessary and no misunderstandings to move forward in the case and to move forward into the next portion, which is frameworking. And then lastly, and James touched on this a little bit, but you can now ask clarifying questions after you're summarizing the prompt. So this would be, a clarifying question would basically be if you're confused about a specific term that was used in the prompt or an idea that was expressed, you can ask your interviewer for clarification, and most of the time they will give it to you. What you don't want to ask in clarifying questions is for specific data, right? Because the questions regarding specific data is really reserved for pushing the case forward after you've done your frameworking and kind of evaluated what are the different categories of the problem that you want to look at. So we're going to do an example of the prompt. Does anyone have any questions on these 3 steps before we move on?
About the clarifying questions, how vague, how specific, I guess, do they have to be? So like in the last case, if I didn't know anything about unmanned UAVs, would it be too vague to ask, like, is there anything about this industry that would be unusual, or is there anything I should know?
Yeah, so I think you don't want to go that like broad or that like vague in your questions. You probably want to ask more pointed questions. So like, for example, if you don't know, I don't know, like if you don't know what a UAV is, right, then you could ask a clarifying question about a UAV. Or if you, I don't know, if you don't know like how these items are sold, right, you could ask a specific question, right? Like usually like aircrafts for military purposes are sold through like contracts, right? Rather than like, I don't know, selling them to like a consumer. So those would be more of the types of clarifying questions that you ask.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect. Anyone else?
Yeah, Nick, in our next section, do you also mind talking a little bit more about how to take effective and notes during like the case interview so that the notes we take will be relevant and will help us like get through the case? Because I'm not exactly sure, because given limited time, right, we might panic or we don't know like which exactly what the interview said is relevant in solving the case.
Yeah, perfect. So again, how I think you should go about doing this, right, is at the minimum you should have these three like factors in your notes, right? So like you should have any details about the company that you think are important. And when I say important, right, like half of that is kind of just like feeling out what's important to like the company, but also like, you know, like for example, if they give you where the company is based out of, that's probably something important, right? Or if they give you like what the company does, that's also something like important that you always want to include. The next is, right, like the specific problem that they have. So in our dark sky example, right, it was stagnating sales. So that's something that you definitely want to write down because you know that's going to be related to what they're asking you to solve for. And then like the last thing you want is the ask, right? So that's like specifically what the client is asking of you to solve for, or for what the recommendation should be about. So how, in terms of like logistics, how I would take notes, right, is just like on the side of your page, you bullet point down like specific notes. You use shorthand when necessary. You can like come up with your own shorthand before the interview and like practice using it, just so like you don't have to write out like revenue like a bunch of times, right? Because that just takes up time, where you could just like write like R or something like that. So I think that's kind of how you would mitigate that. Does that answer your question?
Of course, thank you so much.
Perfect. So let's move on to the example. And if there's any other questions, we can ask it then. Okay, cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read this case to you guys. And then I'll ask everyone to give me like one important point of information in the prompt. For clarification, this is what's called a profitability case, where they're specifically asking you the ask will be about like, or the problem will be held like somewhere around like profitability or something surrounding profitability of the company. Cool. So your client is Heavy Things Fitness, a small fitness chain, a center chain with 15 locations in a minor metropolitan area in the US, established during the fitness boom in the late 70s. After decades of continual growth, Heavy Things has seen membership decline by alarming rates. Over the past 5 years, it has seen total membership numbers decrease an average of 6% annually. The client has asked us to determine what is causing this trend and how they can reverse this trend to begin growing again. Based on what you know about this industry, what do you believe is causing this membership attrition? Okay, so what do you guys think are the most important points in this prompt? Just give me one.
Their 15 locations are in a minor metropolitan area.
Yeah, perfect. So exactly. So like the number of locations and then where they're located. Cool. Anyone else?
Big competitors,
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
big competitors that we see coming into this industry.
Perfect. So that's another key like part of the prompt, especially given like what they're asking for you, or what they're asking of you. Cool. Anyone else?
Sorry, the annual average 6% decrease.
The average 6% decrease in membership. Perfect, because that's directly relating to what like the ask of the prompt is. Cool. Anyone else?
Also, like the decrease comes like suddenly after continual growth.
Perfect. So like specifically, like what was the trend of the decline in membership? So those are all really good points. So let's see what I have highlighted. Okay, so the first thing I highlighted was the name of the company, because that's really important, right? Because you want to be able to customize the case and constantly refer back to what actually the name of the company is. Again, as someone said, the 15 locations, that's something important. Something else I didn't highlight, but is also kind of important, right, is that they're located in the US, specifically, right, in like city areas. And then, okay, what the problem is, that there has been this membership decline. And then also notice how anything that is like, anything that's quantitative, any number figures that they're giving me, I'm writing it down, right? Whether it be like the 15 locations or the decrease average of 6% annually, right? And so this goes back to like a question that was asked previously, right? About like, how do we know what's the important information in the prompt, or how do we effectively take notes? A good rule of thumb is always write down anytime they give you a number, right? Because numbers probably will go to the calculations, or numbers will go to like describing a trend or something that'll be useful for your framework. And then, right, the last thing that we talked about is the acts. So they want to figure out how they can reverse this trend to begin growing again. And they also want to figure out what's causing this membership attrition, right? Or this decrease in membership. Cool. Does anyone have any questions relating to the prompt? Or what I highlighted?
Yeah, I wanted to clarify something.
Yeah.
So earlier you mentioned how there's like 15 locations. Are they all within one minor metropolitan area, or they're like located in many different metropolitan areas?
Perfect. So I think I'm not exactly sure for this case. It seems to me, based on like the wording, that it's in like one city. But what I would say is that's like a good clarifying question that you can ask the interviewer. Cool. Anyone else?
Are there any targets for the reversal or growth targets?
Okay, yeah. Oh, I see. So like, would that be like a clarifying question that you're asking?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay, yeah, perfect. So that's like a good example of a clarifying question, right? Because you just want to know like specifically, oh, like what's the growth target that the company is aiming for. Cool. So moving on, so right after we do the steps of the prompt, right? We hear the prompt, we summarize it back, ask our clarifying questions if we need to. Again, they're optional. If you don't need to clarify anything, you don't have to. But now we get into the frameworking. So what'll happen is you'll be like, oh, do you mind if I have a minute to collect my thoughts, or to gather my thoughts? And that's when you'll start writing down your framework on the problem of the problem. So the first thing you want to do is at the top of the page, you want to restate the problem just so you know what it is. And then what you want to do is explain the methodology you use to examine it. So how do we do this, right? So we do it through a concept called bucketing your ideas. So what this is essentially you're grouping your ideas into different categories to organize your thoughts, right? So like what James did is he like bucketed it into, I think we have an example, right? Yeah, so like he bucketed it into like the company itself, the customers, the UAV competitors, and then profitability. So those were what he thought were like the key categories to analyzing the problem. And so what you want to make sure of is that your buckets are MISI. So what MISI is it stands for mutually exclusive, meaning that there is no overlap in between all the buckets, and then also collectively exhaustive, meaning that the buckets all jointly or collectively, right? Or give a comprehensive evaluation of the problem, or look at the problem from like all the possible different angles. So that's what essentially you're doing when you're writing out those categories and when you're frameworking. And the last thing that you want to do is you want to push the case forward. So again, what James did is that he picked the bucket that he thought was most important to either A, solving the case, or B, right, what he thinks most likely they will have data on or most likely have an exhibit on. Usually they have like, for example, exhibits on like financial information. So that's always like my go-to bucket, like profitability. And then you ask the interviewer for specific info to help solve the problem. So like what I mean by specific info also is like, you don't want to ask, oh, like, do you have any information on like company financials, right? That's like super broad. You want to ask about like, so for example, in Dark Sky, like, oh, what is what's the revenue that we get from the assessor, right? Or like what are like the revenue and cost breakdown of selling the assessor over like the past number of years? That's like specific information that they'll want. If you ask something that's overly broad, don't worry, because the interviewer will just be like, oh, can you like be more specific about like what data you want in terms of profitability, right? So they'll like push you forward like that. Cool. So we're gonna get into examples of this, but does anyone have any questions in regards to frameworking?
So say you ask a specific question about like profitability and they don't have that. What would you do? Would you likely ask for something else or switch your bucket? Or which...
Yeah, so that's really what the other three or the other X number of buckets you have are for, right? So say, for example, they don't have any information on profitability. You know that's probably not likely the route that you should take. So you'll say, oh, okay, instead, let's look towards this bucket, right? Which is probably what your like next idea of the most likely place that you'll have information, or like the next most useful information to solve the problem, and that's what you'll do. And then so like hopefully you get it by like the first or second time, but if you don't, you'll just continually go through like your buckets or like specific points under your bucket. Cool. Anyone else? Okay, great. So this is an example. This is like kind of like a template of a framework that you can use, where right at the top, you have like what the company is asking you to solve. You write that like at the top of your framework. And then you can break down, a good framework that we use is called 3 C's and a P. So this is broken down into company, consumer, competition, and profitability. This is a really good way of analyzing a majority of the cases that you're going to get. And then within each of these categories, you have like your subtopics, right? So let's go back to like what James did, right? So he's using our 3 C's and a P's framework. Mind you, he's kind of altering the bucket names to make them more customizable to the case. And then he has all these subtopics under the categories. Notice how they're not like long sentences, or they're not like paragraphs about like what, like thoroughly explaining his ideas. All he's writing down are like specific terms that then when he presents his framework, he's going to elaborate on like off the top of his head. This is just a way to really make sure that you get your framework written down in that like 1 minute to like 1 minute 20 like time frame. And then that you don't go over, you don't spend time like on like one bucket just writing all this information down. Cool. So what I want to do now is I have an example case for you guys. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to read it aloud to you. We're going to go into breakout rooms, and you'll each have an eBoard member in one of those breakout rooms, and they'll help you kind of walk through and framework the case. And then we'll all meet back up in about like 5 minutes. Okay, cool. So, right, the most important thing with this case is before you framework, you want to pull out what the most important information is to the case. Right, so again, we're talking where we want to know company details, so like the company name, any or what they do, right? They're in the market for apparel, men's casual dress shoes, and then also any quantitative data. So, right, like the $500 million in sales, the market size of the athletic shoe market, that's something that is important. And then lastly, right, the ask, what they want you to help them solve, which is how should they enter the shoe market? Like, should they and how should they, right? Cool. So can anyone from what they did in their breakout room just quickly explain to me like one bucket that they looked at?
Sure. We looked at competitors. That was one of the buckets we looked at, and within it we included like how the market is composed, if it's fragmented, and like the ease of entry into that new market.
Perfect. So competitors is something that's definitely super important to a case like this, right? Because when we're entering a new market, we want to know what we're getting ourselves into, right? Whether that be like, oh, like what's the size of the market? Who are the players that are making up the market? And then are there like barriers to entry, or like what's the cost of entering this market? Those are all definitely like really important information that should go under competitors. Anyone else?
We also
go ahead.
We looked at consumers, and we looked at like if the consumer base, like looking at their like we have to look at their demographics and see if they would be what they would want to buy athletic shoes, since our company has probably been targeting a certain market because we sell like casual dress shoes, so it might be a change in consumer base. So we have to look at that.
Perfect. So I think really that's kind of like the other side of, or like the other point of the question, what are we getting ourselves into, right, by entering this market? So like, who are the consumers that make up this market? What are their demographics, right? What is like the age? Are there like more men or more women? All that demographic information is super important for like how they should enter the market, or if they should enter the market in general. Cool. And anyone else?
Yeah. I was just gonna say that the company is also important, looking into the financials and whether they have the money and the products to enter it organically, or whether they should look into acquiring a company or pursuing a joint venture.
Okay, perfect. So that's a extremely important bucket for how they should enter the market. So let me just pull up like what my example framework is. So I have a very simple framework here, and I have 3 buckets, right? I have the athletic shoe consumers, right? I have the athletic shoe market, and then lastly, I have like a market entry bucket. So what? I'm sorry, what was your name?
Roy.
Roy. Yeah. So what Roy was talking about was the market entry bucket that I have here, or how should they enter the athletic shoe market, right? And so there's 2 ways that a company can enter a market. They can either do this through organic growth, or they could do this through inorganic growth. So what do these terms mean? Well, organic growth means that you enter the market using your in-house capabilities, right? So like, for example, you kind of want to examine like your current manufacturing capabilities, right? And see like, oh, can these be transferable to the athletic shoe market, or are they like very specialized towards the casual shoe market? What are the current channels that we have? Like, who are the stores that we're selling to? Do they also target customers or have customers that are in the athletic shoe market? But then we have inorganic growth, right? So inorganic growth would be like M&A, so mergers or an acquisition. So where you essentially acquire another company, like acquire an athletic shoe company in order to enter the market, or a joint venture where it's essentially you partner up with like another company and create a new entity that will enter the market for you, or that'll be a part of the market. And so basically what you're trying to figure out here is which one will allow you to most profitably enter the market. Is it organic growth or is it inorganic growth? Cool. And then in terms of like the other 2 buckets, I really think we covered this, right? Which is for example, the athletic shoe market. what is the market size of the market. So like what is the total amount that is in the market. And then lastly, like secondly, like what's the market share? So like who are the competitors within the market and what percentage of the market do they take up? And then like lastly, you have barriers to entry, which I think someone mentioned, which in my breakout room, which was that like what are the problems that we might face in order to enter the market, and also like what's the cost of entering the market. And maybe like the barriers to entry, the cost that we incur of entering the market overwhelms the predicted amount of revenue that we would get if we did enter the market. And then maybe that's like a reason why we shouldn't do it. So this is how this is another example of like how you would break down a framework. So does anyone have any questions regarding this? I know it's frameworking definitely can get like super complicated.
I just have a question of how you would push it forward.
Perfect. Right. So let's go back to what the ask is. Hold on. Cool. So the ask in this case, right, is you're trying to figure out like should your client enter the athletic shoe market, right? And so, hold on one second. So basically, again, what I would do is I would pick whatever I think most likely is a bucket that they have either information on or a bucket that would most likely help me in solving for the problem, right? So probably I would start with the athletic shoe market bucket, right? And I would say, do you have any information regarding the competitors that make up the market? In particular, like what is the market share of each of the competitors that make up the market? And then they would be like, I know for this case, they have data on that. So they would be like, oh, great, we have data on the competitors that make up the market. Here it is, analyze the exhibit. And so that's how it would kind of go. Cool. Anyone else?
For something like this, where they're like, should we enter a market? If we decide that like, if the data shows that we shouldn't, are they expecting us to provide an alternative solution, or just like, no, don't do this, and then like figuring out how to make profits otherwise is a different problem?
So if we go back to the three ways we break down a recommendation, right? Solution, risks, next steps. I would say in your solution part, you should say like, oh no, we shouldn't enter the athletic shoe market, right? Because of like X, Y, and Z reason that you found out. But then maybe in your next steps, then you say like, oh, but we still have the existing problem, which is, I think it was something along the lines of like declining sales or something like that. So maybe in the next steps, you could say, oh, we can explore this new way of addressing that problem in the future. So that's how I would go about doing that. Cool. Anyone else?
I had a question. Oh yeah, I had a question about consumers. Can you explain what segmentation is?
Right. So like segmentation kind of goes along with like demographics. You can think about it as like, let's say like for example, like, I don't know, like what percentage of the market, what percentage of consumers like are targeting like a certain athletic shoe, right? Like for example, like there's many different types of athletic shoes. Like there's like tennis shoes, there's running shoes, there's basketball shoes. You could figure out like how the market is segmented in that way, and then also like what types of consumers go towards those markets. Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, segmentation is really just your approach in how you yourself are segmenting the market and considering different categories. So like as Nick said, whether the category be, their preferences and what kind of shoe they want, or their age or anything like that, those are all segmentation approaches.
Okay.
You could also think of sorry, just going off this point, you could also think of segmentation in terms of like, is the market like consolidated? This is in consumers. Sorry. If we're talking about segmentation in terms of like the athletic shoe market, like if we had segmentation under this bucket, it would more refer to, right, like, is the market consolidated within like, is the market consolidated by like a small number of firms, right? Or is it like not as consolidated and like many firms make up the market? That's another way you can look at segmentation, not in the consumers bucket, but in the like competitors bucket. Cool. So I know we are out of time right now, but for if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out or come to our next part of our consulting series, where we'll be covering market sizing as well as brain teasers. We also didn't get really into analyzing the exhibits or the recommendation portion of the case. So we'll, at the top of our presentation for next week, we'll be reviewing what we covered in this lecture, as well as the recommendation portion and the analyzing exhibits portion. So I'll stay back, and some of the e-boards will stay back if you guys have any questions. But thanks so much, guys, for coming out, and I hope to see you all next week.